I'm Billy S, welcome back to the channel. Today we're ranking the areas of Elden Ring. Not to be confused with the regions, that'll be its own list somewhere down the line. This is part 1 of 2, taking a look at areas 22nd through 11th. So if you're looking for my top 10, and spoilers, that's where most of the main legacy dungeons will be, click the card in the top right corner or check the link in the description once that video is live next week. I'll be taking a look at legacy dungeons, notable structures, and underground areas to form this list, because for as open world as Elden Ring is, it's really the locations that inhabit the lands between that give the game its identity. Elden Ring is a very subjective title when it comes to these topics, so if there's an area I didn't include, let me know in the comments so I can explain why I may not have included it. I won't be ranking catacombs, basic caves, or heroes' graves, those will be for a future video one day, and please also note that while I consider the Deeproot Depths and Ainsel River as areas for this list, Shifra River will not be included, as I feel it's honestly big enough to be a region, and houses smaller areas within that will make the list. That's just my take. So, without further ado, all 22 Elden Ring areas ranked. And be sure to let me know your favorites in the comments. To absolutely no one's surprise, the bottom of my list starts with the good old Lake of Rot. What was once a normal underground lake was turned to disease. In the lore, the outer god of rot was sealed away here, and thank God we don't have to fight it. Praying the DLC doesn't throw that at us, I've had enough rot with Malenia. What it means for us the player is that we get to run through the fun, goopy Scarlet Lake, and I hate it so much. It's almost impossible to avoid being rotted, even with the various pathways you can erect by quickly running through the rot water to the different stone platforms. You either have those boluses that heal Scarlet Rot, of which they are very finite due to the limited amount of sacramental buds per playthrough, or you do a mad dash to the Grand Cloister Grace and pray you don't get knocked out by the various basilisks living just beneath the rot's surface, and hope that your healing manages to hold up until you get there. This area asks you to suicide run through just about everything to collect any useful items, and includes 2 of the worst field bosses in the game. The Dragonkin Soldier that you can raise platforms to fight, but that doesn't make anything easier, as well as an ulcerated tree spirit in the channels of the Grand Cloister. Take my advice, get the Golden Seed from somewhere else. It doesn't have a boss health bar, you don't have to fight it. Speaking of the Grand Cloister, I do consider it a part of the Lake of Rot, and it's filled with the kindred of rot enemies that I don't enjoy, and I don't think I know a single person who enjoys. Their projectiles are possibly my least favorite attack in all of Soulsborne, and I dread seeing them in groups because I know no matter my build or health, they can one-shot me on a good day. The only slightly novel concept of the Lake of Rot is the puzzle that lets you fight the Onyx Lord atop the raised platforms, but even then, it's to fight an enemy type you've likely fought multiple times already. At least other Soulsborne poison swamps held some semblance of fairness with their designs. You just can't say the same for the Lake of Rot. Might be a weird choice, but I'm choosing to briefly include the Chapel of Anticipation as an area on this list. The only reason I have to talk about this place is that it's your starting area where you first awaken as a Tarnished. I don't understand the lore for why you're there in the first place, but stepping outside and seeing the lands between, Stormvale in the distance, it's a pretty magical moment. I remember in the marketing when they showed off the Stormvale castle for the demos, you could see the chapel from far away, and I thought, I want to go there as I watched. Little did I know it was actually our spawn point. Most notable for having a grafted scion that will kill you immediately before forcing you to the real tutorial of the game, this area only truly makes this list because you can revisit it later via the 4 belfries. This was a pretty novel moment for my first playthrough, as I got the chance to get revenge on that scion who handed me my ass. as well as being able to collect some new spirit ashes, including the one you can bring to Nefeli Lu Warrior's questline to get a happy conclusion. Worth it including this area on this list just for that. Another small location that nobody really thinks about, but that feels significant enough to include on this list, is the Cardian Study Hall that leads to the Divine Tower of Liurnia. Accessible immediately after you reach the lakes, entering the hall will have you attacked by spectral soldiers and my sworn arch-nemesis, Preceptor Miriam. This one invader made my life a living hell on my first playthrough because she constantly teleports away from you, has insanely good ranged magic, including Loretta's great bow, and if you try to rush her, you'll just get slaughtered by all of her guards. But the study hall hides a much bigger secret. For when you reach the rafters the first time, you can't go anywhere. And it's not until you progress Rani's questline that she gives you the Cardian inverted statue that you can make progress in the Divine Tower. For placing it on the pedestal at the entrance of the study hall will invert the tower, and you'll have to make your way downwards in a really cool set piece. You do have to deal with some hand spiders, as well as a rematch with Preceptor Miriam. But unless you're an idiot like me who walks off the edge for no reason, you shouldn't have trouble with her this time. This area lands on the list for the ingenuity of this inversion trick, and rightfully deserves its flowers, even if in the grand scheme of things, you'll forget this area exists unless you're actively trying to pursue Fia's questline, or you just wanted to go to Jarburg and you saw it nearby. I really don't like ants. They make me very uncomfortable, and I'd rather just pretend they don't exist when I can help it. So you can imagine I don't find Ainsel River a particularly fun area to explore. It doesn't help that there's a high chance you've already been to Shifra River earlier in the playthrough, so going from such a sprawling underground region to a couple ant-filled caverns and some old ruins leading towards the promise of a ruined city that you can't even explore until you progress Rani's questline, is a bit of a letdown. It's fun to explore the first time when you don't know what's around each corner, an ant attack, a hidden cave, ruins. It reminds me of spelunking in Minecraft. I get the exact same vibe exploring Ainsel River as I do going down a dead-end cave shaft and thinking, what was the point in coming down this passage before I'm blown up by a creeper? I think the half-formed Astel in the main ruins area is pretty cool, and I found out I could kill it this time around. But overall, there's just not much to do here. There's a merchant that doesn't sell much of interest, a ton of those slow-moving ruin enemies that feel a bit spammed all over the place, and the first introduction of Elden Ring basilisks. I'm sure we were all hyped to see them, especially near the overlook to our favourite area, Lake of Rot. At least the brief glimpse of Noxtella, a better area, was nice once you reach the boss arena. If you like ants, you will love Ainsel River. But the most interesting part of this area of the underground is a later entry on this list. Just like the Cardian Study Hall, I wanted to include the Divine Tower of Caelid as an area on this list, because unlike other small-scale dungeons in Elden Ring, this one has a shortcut, some tough enemies, and a full-on platforming gimmick that make it well worth the effort of coming to. From the outside, you have to platform your way along the tree roots until you reach the tower itself, and then it's a puzzle to climb your way to the top. The corners of the towers have ladders, or well, some of them do, and it's your job to jump over gaps, take out precariously placed enemies, and just generally climb your way to the top. And in my first playthrough, I got to the top, climbed the elevator to activate Radahn's Great Rune, and promptly fucked off. It wasn't until my boyfriend's playthrough where he found the lower half of the tower that I thought, how did I miss this? So I made it my goal for this footage playthrough to go through this area myself, and I really enjoy that to get up to the Divine Tower, you had to platform upwards, and to get down the Divine Tower, you had to platform downwards. When the floor collapsed from under me the first time, I had a mini heart attack. But I love the gimmick that you're getting to explore what a Divine Tower looks like beyond what you normally see. going into the depths, unsure of what you'll find, and having to avoid some tough enemies along the way, leading to an intense boss fight against my baby, the Godskin Apostle, which is a fitting conclusion for such a quirky little dungeon. If only Soulsborne players didn't despise gravity, I might have rated it higher. Given what I said about Ainsel River, I don't think it's a shock for me to reveal that the next area on my list is the source of both Ainsel and Shifra, the Deeproot Depths. This underground area is a few placements higher due to the sheer size, scope, and history on display as you explore, with more to explore and see, but the Deeproot Depths still suffers from similar problems as Ainsel River, those being the sheer amount of ants and basilisks in the area. Because I love ants and basilisks, I love Deathblight so much. Give me all that Deathblight, Papi Godwin, inject it into my veins and make me a tree. At least with the ants, they go down very quickly with my Twin Blade build, so as long as I play it safe, I don't get killed by them. But with the breeding ground of basilisks hidden within the ruins of whatever city once rested here, it's impossible to explore without being assaulted by hordes of the bug-eyed monsters. It encourages the hit and run strategy of riding in on Torrent, targeting any items you want to collect, grabbing them, and just running away once obtained. If an area forces you to not engage with the content within, something is wrong design-wise. On the plus side, there are a few notable enemies to fight here. There's a rune bear that drops a talisman in a hidden cavern. There's an Erd Tree avatar near the entrance that drops their signature staff. And the field boss of Crucible Knight Siluria. You probably should be able to fight the speared Crucible Knights at this point, and I actually think it's a lot of fun. I don't really fuck with the Walking Mausoleum, but I think they're notable to point out when they appear, alongside their hordes of phantom defenders. But my favourite aspect of the Deeproot Depths is the climbing of the roots to make it to the Prince of Death's arena. Having to dodge the flames of the stationary gargoyles while figuring out which way is correct to get yourself higher, it's a lot of fun. There's a few extra items sprinkled around for those curious to find, with the area ending at the arena where you meet Fia, and fight her champions in the Lich Dragon. It's worth noting this is one of my favourite areas visually, such a vast, toxic open space. I love the attention to detail of the flies that fill the screen the closer you get to Godwin. A great payoff for an area that otherwise doesn't have much substance to it beyond some mysterious lore. The first technical legacy dungeon on this list, though that's debatable among the community, is Redmane Castle on the southern tip of Caelid. Home of the Radahn Festival, it's the only location on this list that can be dramatically different depending on when you choose to visit. On my first playthrough, I arrived here after being directed to Caelid following my ascension to Altus Plateau, and I found myself surrounded by warriors as we all prepared to face down Radahn. It was an odd experience because I didn't actually use the waygate on the bridge to warp straight there. I ended up taking the side path into the castle that you'd use in its other gameplay state, and found all the doors to be locked. They don't let you explore the area to collect any items until you've beaten Radahn and ended the festival, or alternatively, you have to explore Redmane Castle before reaching Altus Plateau or progressing Ranni's questline. For this playthrough, I made it my goal to experience the actual dungeon side of Redmane, and it was fine. The most notable unique element of the dungeon is actually how you enter. The Great Bridge leading to the castle is this death trap, so you have to take a waygate from Fort Gale on the left side of Caelid, which warps you across the Great Bridge. From there, the journey to breach the castle walls is pretty fun, involving you fighting through waves of enemies as you press up towards the main gate, before taking Torrent and hopping around the cliffside to the south. My only complaint about this sequence is that dying will force you to recomplete Fort Gale to return to Redmane, as they don't give you a sight of grace until you get into the castle walls themselves right before the boss arena. It's a pretty brutal punishment, especially if you're like me and get caught by this simple hole along the cliffs. The inside of the fort is more traditional, with various rooms to explore that you can access through the courtyards, a host of items to find, some cookbooks, and paths leading up to the rooftops where you can find some extra goodies. I'm not a fan of the two lion guardians near the entrance. At this point in the game, fighting the pair at once is a death trap. I wouldn't recommend it. Especially, as said, you won't have unlocked a save point until you reach the site of grace near the boss fog that happens to be past them. I feel like without the Radahn festival being here, this castle would be pretty forgettable as a location. After all, you've already been to places like Castle Morn and Stormvale Castle at this point, both of which I consider to be more interesting and way better designed than Redmane. And the less I say about the Crucible Knight Leonine Misbegotten gank boss, the better. Thank God you can kill the Misbegotten with time to spare before the Crucible Knight shows up, otherwise I'd be having a miserable time with two very aggressive enemies. It really shows how little the developers cared about the dungeon aspect of Redmane Castle when a majority of players won't even think it's an explorable area because of the Radahn Festival event. It's just a baffling design decision and really brings the location down for me. I had to debate on whether I felt the Shaded Castle was better or worse than Redmane. Because on paper, I think this hidden location in Altus Plateau has more of what I dislike about Soulsborne areas, mainly being the tedious outer swamp that has overtaken the castle's moat. But I find the actual level itself to be a fairly inoffensive and fun location that hides a surprisingly unique boss at its top. My area rankings aren't supposed to take main bosses into account though, so I'll try and justify this placement by talking about the actual area progression. Unlike other swamps in FromSoft games, the Shaded Castle swamp is a much shorter experience. If you know the route, you can rush your way through the various ladders that take you inwards to the main castle without much worry, but you'd potentially be missing out on a series of collectibles, some perfume bottles, and the champion's song painting hidden on one of the side paths. The enemy selection isn't my favourite, I'll admit. Basilisks, Wraithcallers, and you know where there be Wraithcallers, there be Revenants. I think I managed to avoid all the Revenant encounters on my trip here this time around, but I know if you explore certain points in the swamp, or the main courtyard of the actual castle, you will find them. The area itself is fun to explore, where you'll wrap around the castle in a clockwise direction, unlocking a shortcut as you go until you reach the lift leading to the boss fog. Here you'll likely get your first proper introduction to the Cleanrot Knights as regular enemies. These servants of Melania are mostly fun to fight with the exception of their spear grab that inflicts scarlet rot, and they're good practice for your eventual trip to the Halig Tree in the late game. The dogs can still fuck off though, I don't like them. You also need to visit this area for plot reasons, as on a side path you can find the Valkyrie's prosthesis, which is required to progress Millicent's questline. And outside to the left of the castle, you can find a survivor of the Murray massacre. Malay Murray. What a name. He's pretty simple to kill, you can lure him towards the giant golem chilling nearby, and with his death, House Murray is completely decimated. Are we sure we're the good guys here? I think we just did Elema's work for him. Perhaps the most mysterious of the more minor explorable dungeons in Elden Ring, Castle Sol on the mountaintops of the Giants seemingly has a lot more to do with the lore of the lands between than you'd first think. To even arrive, you have to explore a majority of the mountaintops, making it past a dangerous graveyard filled with the spirits of skeletons reborn by a tibia mariner, and then a deathrite bird that attempts to halt your progress. Fuck that deathrite bird. But follow the sound of the nearby walking mausoleum, and you'll find your way to the castle without much trouble. Beyond the constant sound of the bells tolling, I find Castle Sol to be a fun location to explore. It's large enough that it requires a mid-level site of grace, and you have to go through some pretty tricky setups as you explore. From the two guardian lions at the entrance that, unlike Redmane Castle's pair, you're actually equipped to handle now, to the series of warhawks that will fly through the air and tear you a new one. One of my favourite moments involves going along the battlements while the spectral soldiers of Castle Sol attempt to firebomb you, and then shoot you with ballistas. It's a real learning experience when it comes to spatial awareness, and while difficult, provides a satisfying conclusion, as it leads to the hidden sorcerer painting collectible. On the main path, there's a church containing one of the game's legendary armaments, the Eclipse Shotel, and let me tell you, this Shotel and the ghost nearby that link Mikola to the Eclipse is prime lore fodder for the upcoming DLC. as the eclipse is also related to Godwyn, Prince of Death, and that means there's now a link between him and Miquella. And which two demigods have we yet to fight in the game? Perhaps my favourite moment of Castle Sol is a side path along the ramparts that leads to the +1 Cerulean Amber Medallion, as you'll come into contact with a dual-wielding Banished Knight, and he's impossible to sneak up on, instead letting you know, nothing personal kid, as he warps behind and scares the living daylights out of you. Easily the toughest enemy in the castle, I died to him once, but was able to come out victorious on my second go-around. Castle Sol also has props for being an important location for accessing Miquella's Halig tree, as you can find the second half of the medallion here, linking Commander Niall and his nationless nation to that of Miquella, which makes sense. Miquella's Halig tree is seemingly a place for the unwanted and those shunned by society, and Niall's unit would fit that bill. I just think Castle Sol is a neat little dungeon that, while it doesn't do anything crazy or new, is able to provide a fun experience all the same so late into the game. Just 2 more smaller explorable areas of the game to go, and then it's major dungeons all the way to the end. So let's talk about the one redeeming factor of Ainsel River, the Eternal City of Noxtella. Found after progressing Ranni's questline and warping from Renna's Rise, this is the second Eternal City you explore and connects Ainsel River to the Lake of Rot, while also being a technical revisit, assuming you've been here earlier in the game when you fought the Dragonkin Soldier of Noxtella. This area takes the concepts introduced in the Eternal City of Nokron, which we'll be seeing next week, and expands them into a unique explorable dungeon. Immediately, you have 2 paths, either head up the stairs to the city itself, or explore the grounds and face the hordes of silver tears and the Nox enemies riding giant ants. What's interesting is that progression for Ranni's questline is as simple as heading to the other side of the lower area and taking an elevator down to the next site of grace. So the entire city above is an optional part of exploration, but so worth visiting because there's a host of great loot to find. From spirit ashes to talismans, skipping this place would be criminal on a first playthrough. Here we're introduced to silver tears that discharge electricity. If you kill one while it's charged up, it'll explode upon death and deal that damage around to other enemies, which can create a chain reaction if you time it right. A few of the silver tears utilize the classic Souls Phalanx strategy, with the front-facing shields, but it's as simple as walking behind them and pulling out your sword. Perhaps the most infamous part of Noxtella are the silver spheres, my favourite of course being the one that slowly comes down the far stairs towards you. We've all seen that Twitter clip of someone thinking they've outsmarted the sphere only to get instantly humbled. One of my favourite enemies in the game for the sheer stupidity of the idea. Let's have a boulder trap, but the boulder is sentient, it can chase intruders itself. Brilliant. I really also like the various Nox enemies you can fight. They each wield vastly different weapons, and the stretchy nature of their attacks gives me Monkey D. Luffy One Piece vibes. I love weapons that can crowd control, or weapons that have properties you wouldn't expect, and combined with the really sleek design of the monks, swordstresses, and maidens, it's always a good time. Eventually though, you'll get through the whole dungeon and loop back around to the lower path, but it's worth it for the runes you get from killing all the enemies and the equipment you'll find through the various chests and coffins. Plus, I have a little soft spot for being able to see the Dragonkin Soldier boss room from earlier in the game as I explored. I live for being able to see past areas from future ones, and vice versa. Noxtella ends following the Site of Grace down the elevator, where you'll have one matchup against the Baleful Shadow, who is absolutely brutal, might I add, before giving you access to the best area in Soulsborne, the Lake of Rot. See entry 22 for more information. Noxtella is really only held back by its size. It's well designed, and for what it is, very fleshed out, but I couldn't help but want a tiny bit more. Had they perhaps moved the Nox Swordstress and Nox Priest boss fight in Celia Town of Sorcery to the end of Noxtella and given them a slightly more dynamic moveset to separate them from the regular enemies, this area could have been in my top 10. What will likely be your first proper in-depth dungeon you explore, Castle Morn lies on the tip of the Weeping Peninsula and acts as a great mini-example of what the main Legacy dungeons will be like later in the game. It challenges the player with a ton of different mechanics, while also giving you extra incentive to visit due to the arena questline you get as you arrive on the peninsula. You're told to find her father Edgar and deliver him a letter, so off you go. Immediately, the approach to the castle lets you know you're in for a fun time, as a large golem archer will attempt to snipe you from afar. You have to use the classic serpentine maneuver to get past the creature without getting blown to bits, and once inside the castle, the true challenge begins. The hardest part of this level is the opening courtyard at the top of the elevator. It's filled with misbegotten enemies that can very quickly overwhelm you if you're not careful, and alerting one tends to alert the rest. In my first playthrough, I killed them all and then fought the mad pumpkin enemy before climbing the ladder to the roof. But what I discovered in this playthrough is that Castle Morn has 2 progression paths leading to the same place. If you climb up the hill in the courtyard, there's an entire room I never found in my playthrough, leading to a balcony where some misbegotten enemies execute a knight, followed by a ladder leading up to an extra portion of the rooftops I never found. Castle Morn really teaches the player to explore because there are extra goodies around every corner. Once the paths converge and you progress along the battlements, you can head on to the next Grace or take a detour to check on Edgar. Now, his position in Castle Morn is my only issue, as he's so far out of the way, and you have to check on him after beating the dungeon, which takes time because you can only access him from the starting Grace of the area. Just a little complaint. I really enjoyed the back half of Castle Morn, dropping down rooftops and bridges to make my way to the beach below. This is the sort of platforming you just wouldn't get in older Souls games, at least not to this extent, and it's only expanded upon as you reach the proper Legacy dungeons of Elden Ring later in the game. All of this leading to a small beach filled with spectral jellyfish and the boss arena. I love that Castle Morn takes you up to the top of the castle, then down the cliff sides, and leaves you at the beach below, as it's not your traditional dungeon progression path. Logic dictates you'd find the main boss fight of the area in the middle of the castle, in a dungeon or a throne room, but no, it's more unique in that aspect. And I've already gushed about how I really enjoy the Leonine Misbegotten's boss arena, very Senua's Sacrifice vibes, with a hint of Orphan of Kos and the Dark Link arena from the Water Temple of Ocarina of Time. And of course, they had to get that one gravestone asset in there. Souls fans, you know the one I'm talking about. Castle Morn may be forgotten as you progress further into the game, but the lessons it teaches you and the genuine fun of traversing it when you're just starting out cannot be overstated, and it remains my favourite of the mini Legacy dungeon style areas of Elden Ring. So let's get on to the main ones, shall we? The next 11 areas on this list are the main big dungeons, the places you think of when you imagine Elden Ring. But one of those locations sadly didn't make it into my top 10 and won't be featured in part 2. Just missing out, not invited to the party, is Miquella's Haligtree. Specifically, everything up to Knight Loretta, as I consider Elphael, Brace of the Haligtree, as an entirely separate area. So why does Miquella's Haligtree just miss out on my top 10? To put it simply, Soulsborne players hate gravity, and so do I. The level tries to play around with gravity and platforming, but doesn't really have the right enemy variety to mix it up and make it feel special. The first half, where you're having to navigate a precarious set of branches, initially seems like it wants you to play nice and slow, take out enemies carefully and strategically to make your way further along. But then the Oracle Envoy enemies reject that by being incessantly brutal in how they target you with your bubbles. And God forbid you meet the gaze of the giant Oracle Envoy near the end of the area who can one-shot you with his bubbles even at extremely high vigor. There's nothing worse than dying to enemy projectiles and realizing you have to clear everything out all over again. So it ends up promoting rushing past enemies, grabbing the items you need to grab, which opens up the possibility to make more mistakes, and that cycle just isn't very fun. I understand the difficulty spike is because this is a secret endgame area, but I don't know, places like Archdragon Peak in Dark Souls 3 that are also secret areas don't make me want to just skip them and run past everything. Then there's the town itself, which is gorgeous in its design, looking straight out of Lord of the Rings with the Rivendell high elven fantasy vibe, happens to be filled with a ton of reused enemies. And that's perhaps the part of the Halig tree that disappoints me the most. For a proper legacy dungeon, you expect to see some unique enemy types that differentiate it from the rest of the world, but instead we get the dregs of the misbegottens, spirit caller snails that can summon crystallians, a few battle mages near the end that feel so out of place. I understand that the Halig tree is made to be this safe haven for downtrodden species so that they have a reason to reuse enemy types, but then where are the Albinoric enemies? We've heard they sought the Halig tree, but aside from Loretta herself, there are none to be found. Why do I have to fight more misbegotten crusaders? I already handled one as a boss not too long ago. At least the level design of the actual village is more enjoyable, with multiple upper and lower paths to take, and it is easy to run through if you just want to try and reach Loretta as quickly as possible. And there are some good endgame talismans to collect, including the Pearl Drake Talisman +2, and the Viridian Amber Medallion +2 for you stamina lovers out there. But of all of the legacy dungeons, it's the one I'd least like to revisit, and is the one with the least replayability, being far more linear than all of its counterparts. Even Elfale, which just follows the Halig tree, has a much larger sense of non-linearity. It's like night and day. So that's why the Halig tree ends the first part of our list, and this video. Thank you everyone for watching. Next week is the top 10. That's where all the good areas are, and low-key, the ones you actually care about. I hope you enjoyed. Please be sure to parry that subscribe button for more weekly content. I'm currently on holiday as this video is airing, and I will try to reply to as many of your comments as possible. My socials are on screen now. Feel free to follow where you feel comfortable. I recommend my Twitter. A massive shout out to my patrons over on Patreon. You guys are awesome and you keep the channel alive. And I will see you guys next week for my top 10. Adios.